Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and immediately change it? Not because of what they said, not because of how they looked, but because of something harder to name. A certainty that seemed to radiate outward before a single word was spoken. The air around them just rearranges. Eyes move, posture shifts. People who are mid-sentence pause, recalibrate, and quietly wait. You've seen this happen with Donald Trump. Whether you admire him or despise him, something happens in the nervous system when he speaks. There's a pull or a resistance, or both at once. But almost nobody walks away neutral. And that itself is worth slowing down for. Because the question isn't whether you agree with him. The question is what exactly is happening psychologically. Why does a man who has been bankrupted, investigated, impeached, indicted, and publicly ridiculed by large portions of the world still project the unshakable sense that he is winning? That isn't delusion. Or rather, it isn't only delusion, it's something far more interesting. And understanding it tells you something important, not just about one man, but about what confidence actually is, where it comes from, and why the human brain responds to it the way it does. Most people think of confidence as a feeling, something that rises when things are going well and falls when they aren't. It's reactive, conditional, it depends on results, on feedback, on the world reflecting something positive back at you. Trump's confidence doesn't work that way. It doesn't appear to rise or fall based on external circumstances. Losses are reframed as setbacks engineered by others. Criticism is dismissed as jealousy or incompetence. Failures become evidence of how threatening he is to the establishment. The internal narrative never shifts toward defeat. Psychologists who have studied his profile describe him as genuinely imperturbable under pressure, not as performance, but as a core feature of his personality structure. This is unusual. Most people's confidence is a mirror. His functions more like a wall, and walls, it turns out, have a very specific psychological effect on the people standing in front of them. To understand why this kind of confidence commands attention, you have to go back further than any election, further back than any boardroom or rally. You have to return to the oldest leadership dynamics in human history. Evolutionary psychologists distinguish between two fundamental forms of leadership. The first is prestige leadership, earned through demonstrated skill, knowledge, and the respect it generates over time. The second is dominance leadership, based on fear, power, and the projection of superiority. Dominance leadership dates much further back in our evolutionary past. For most of human prehistory, the dominant figure in a group was the one who projected the strongest signal of unbreakable certainty. Not the wisest, not the most cooperative, the most unshakable. Because in an environment full of physical threat and genuine danger, unwavering confidence read as safety. If the leader doesn't flinch, maybe we survive this. That ancient wiring hasn't disappeared. Researchers note that Trump's personality is especially suited to this dominance-oriented style, and that for millions of people, it carries a genuinely primal appeal. The brain isn't evaluating a policy position, it's reading a signal, and the signal says, this person is not afraid. In a world that feels chaotic and threatening, that signal lands deep. But where does confidence like this actually come from? Because it doesn't simply appear. It is built, often in ways the person themselves never fully understood. Trump grew up in a home where his father, Fred Trump, treated neediness of any kind as weakness. Vulnerability wasn't processed or held, it was penalized. Donald Trump, observing this from childhood, made a choice to mimic his father, to shun neediness, suppress most emotions, and never publicly admit failure or fault, which would be seen as an intolerable act of weakness. When a child grows up in an environment where doubt is dangerous, the nervous system adapts. It builds a specific kind of armor. The brain learns to interpret uncertainty not as information to be processed, but as a threat to be repelled. Admitting you don't know becomes the same as admitting you are weak. And weakness in that household was not survivable, so the confidence isn't a strategy. It's a survival mechanism that became a personality. It was forged under conditions where projecting certainty was the only available form of safety. By adulthood, it was simply who he was. The armor had become the skin. This is where the psychology becomes genuinely fascinating, because the confidence that was originally built as protection ends up functioning as power. And the mechanism behind that is something every human brain carries. Psychologists who study Trump's appeal point to an unusual combination: extremely high extroversion, very low agreeableness, and pronounced narcissism. On their own, those traits can be destabilizing in a leader. Together, in a specific kind of environment, they create something else entirely. They create a figure that is impossible to ignore. The human brain is wired to track certainty. When someone in a room projects absolute conviction, mirror neurons activate. We begin to simulate their internal state. We feel something of what they appear to feel. Researchers studying narcissistic leaders have found that a certain level of grandiose narcissism actually predicts leadership effectiveness, because fearless dominance makes it easier to move through conflict, make difficult decisions, and draw followers who are searching for an anchor. In other words, the brain doesn't always evaluate the message. Sometimes it simply locks onto the certainty of the messenger, and if that messenger never wavers, the brain keeps returning. Because certainty in an uncertain world is deeply, biologically comforting. There is, of course, a layer beneath the performance that rarely gets named. Researchers who study narcissistic personality structures note that the narcissist dreads, above almost everything else, the moment their supreme self is challenged or their vulnerability is exposed. The confidence that looks impenetrable from the outside is often, at its foundation, a defense against an internal experience that feels intolerable. Not arrogance as a choice, arrogance as a fortress. This is worth sitting with, because when you understand that the unshakable confidence is not simply ego but a deeply constructed shield, the behavior stops looking like pure aggression and starts looking like something more recognizable. A nervous system that learned very early that softness was dangerous, that uncertainty was unacceptable, that the only way to survive in the world your father described, where everyone is either a winner or a loser, was to never allow yourself to be seen as the latter. Most people never build a fortress that visible, but many people build one. The materials are just quieter. So what do we actually learn from studying this particular psychology? Not about politics, about the architecture of confidence itself. We learn that confidence is not the absence of fear. It's often the most elaborate response to it. We learn that the human brain is still running ancient software. It responds to dominant signals in ways that bypass rational evaluation. A person who projects absolute certainty will move through rooms, negotiations, and electorates in ways that a more self-aware, more genuinely humble person often cannot. We learn that the traits formed in childhood don't disappear, they scale. The boy who was taught that admitting weakness meant losing his father's approval became the man who cannot afford, psychologically, to ever concede a loss. The armor that kept him safe in that house ended up being worn in front of the entire world. And finally, we learn something about what we respond to as a culture, because Trump's confidence didn't create its own audience. It found one. Millions of people carrying their own uncertainty, their own sense that the world had become chaotic and difficult to navigate, looked at that wall of unshakable certainty and felt something. Not agreement, necessarily, just the ancient primal comfort of someone who doesn't seem afraid. The question worth asking isn't why he projects it. It's what it reveals about what we are still, underneath everything, searching for. If this video named something you've been thinking about but couldn't quite articulate, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. And if you want more conversations like this, the quiet psychological patterns beneath the headlines, consider subscribing. We explore these spaces together.